Welcome back. So the Correctional Services Department is planning to revise South Africa's 20-year parole system. Minister Pieter Groenewald told Parliament that this is due to the high reoffending rates among parolees, especially in the Western Cape. Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services researcher Sohela Surajpal joins us now for more on this. Sohela, good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us. Such an important discussion, and the Minister for Correctional Services sharing with Parliament some interesting details there, where he talks about 36% of parolees released in certain Cape Flats. He talks about communities like Elsie's River, Grassy Park, I think Delft as well, reoffend. So 36% reoffending rate in parolees in the Western Cape. I'm keen to hear if you agree with that number, and perhaps if we then step out and go, okay, bird's eye view in other parts of the country, what that number looks like. Yeah.
That's a great question, Aledi, because I think it's important context for us to have if we're going to talk about parole and reoffending honestly. The statistics that the minister shared are genuinely frightening, but in JIX's view, they are outliers. They're not reflective of parole and reoffending in our country more generally, though they clearly, as the minister explained, point to a serious problem in those areas. And we don't dispute the department's figures. In our experience, the department shares very accurate figures, but the department's figures also tell us in their latest annual report that of the more than 45,000 people who have been released on parole, who are currently parolees in our communities, there's a 99% compliance rate with parole conditions. So if those figures are accurate, that means that most people who are released on parole aren't committing heinous crimes, they aren't reoffending, they're complying with the laws of our country, they're complying with the conditions of their parole. Obviously, there are particular areas in our country which the minister has now made us very aware of, and which it's important to be aware of, that have particular problems that we need to address. But we have to acknowledge both when the parole system is broken and not working, and when it is doing what it is meant to do, which, according to the department's figures, seems to be the vast majority of cases.
Yeah, I mean, just the numbers, if you go into the details of them, really quite startling, right? So he puts forward, I suppose, what is the pattern of what he's noticed in some of these areas. So he looks at Delft, for instance, in the Western Cape. He says 721 parolees released into Delft. That's between 2019 and 2024. Now, I want the viewer to just follow with me here. So 700 over a period of 5 years released into that one area that is Delft, parolees. All of these were people that were convicted for various crimes: 121 for murder, 31 for attempted murder, 99 for sexual assault, 77 for aggravated murder, and he says 21 for assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm. Gosh, okay. But the reason why I raise that is because what the minister essentially puts forward is that somehow the system is releasing parolees that have been convicted for very, what do you call it, hard crimes, right?
Yeah, that's true. But it's not true that it's very easy to be released on parole, especially when you've committed really serious crimes. So when we're thinking about people who have committed the most serious, the most horrible crimes, we're often thinking about people who've been sentenced to life. And at JIX, we've been concerned for a very long time about parole for people sentenced to life, not because it's too easy to get parole, but because it's actually incredibly, incredibly difficult. When we transitioned to democracy in our country, people who were sentenced to life had to serve about 15 years of their sentence before they became eligible for parole. We reformed that in our law, and now they have to serve 25 years. So we've added on 10 years before they can even begin to apply for parole. And that doesn't guarantee them release on parole. In fact, the latest figures we've received from the minister's office tell us that for the month of March, the minister approved only 0.6% of the parole applications for people sentenced to life that were presented to him. So it's a tiny proportion of people who've committed these really awful crimes who are being released into our societies. And it's after they've served an incredibly long time in our prisons and after they've been through generally extensive rehabilitation programs, multiple reports from psychologists, from social workers. And so it's very fair for people to be concerned when we release people who've done horrible things back into our communities. And it's especially fair in communities where there seems to be a high rate of reoffending. But we shouldn't let that convince us that it's very easy for people to be released on parole and that we don't actually have a very strict, very harsh parole system for those people.
Yeah, but you've got, for instance, the Democratic Alliance saying that where we do see parolees reoffending, saying that what this does is it adds to the problem of gang violence in communities, right? It intensifies organized crime in the Cape Flats. I mean, what do you say to that? Because the gangs exist in the prisons and certainly in the communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a mistake to think of a prison as completely locked away, as isolated from our communities. Prisons and our communities, there's a revolving door. And one of the issues that contributes to reoffending and that we're particularly concerned about at JIX is that overcrowding, corruption, violence, gangs in prisons can mean that they're not places where rehabilitation takes place in a really effective, reliable way. We once had a department official describe prisons to us as schools for crime, because people might go into those prisons having committed petty crimes, and they might come out hardened criminals because that's what they've had to do to survive in those conditions. And so combating gangs in prison is really important, but so is combating the causes of crime in our communities, so that when we release people from prison, having completed their rehabilitation programs, that we aren't pushing them back into the same conditions that push them into crime in the first place.
Yeah, interesting. So what do we do? So the minister says we need to relook at the parole system. I don't know what sort of recommendation that would look like when the situation is so different depending on where in the country you are. So can you, for instance, legislate and say, well, this is how we deal with parolees in the Western Cape versus how you do in Mpumalanga, for instance, considering the high rate of gang violence in the Western Cape? Is that sectioning even possible?
I think that would be very difficult to do, but how parole works at the moment for people who are not sentenced to life, because for people who are sentenced to life, the minister is the ultimate decision maker for parole. But for all other inmates who apply for parole, those decisions are made by parole boards. And there are specific parole boards for particular areas or regions in the country. And those parole boards are made up of chairs and members from the department and skilled, qualified individuals, but they're also made up of members of the community. And so ideally how that should work is that what those community members can offer is an understanding of the challenges in the community, what those parolees might face when they're released, how difficult it might be for them to reintegrate. And so I think that's how we get a community-specific perspective, and that already exists, but there are problems with our parole boards. And at JIX, what we've been concerned about is that there are many, many vacancies in parole boards. So at the moment, our latest figures tell us 26% of our country's parole boards don't currently have a chairperson. That means they can't sit and make decisions about parole for those areas. And we think that the department has to be empowered to hire skilled, qualified people to retain community members. We have to have interested community members. And we have to provide those members of parole boards with really good training, really good guidelines and standards so that they're making the best possible decisions about parole. I think that's how we get community-specific decisions about parole rather than these really broad, overarching legislative amendments and obstacles.
Yeah, so this is interesting. Any input that your own structure will be making when it comes to reform to the parole system?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest recommendations we want to make, and obviously that'll depend on the outcomes of the study that the minister implements, but we're really, really concerned about the lack of rehabilitation skills, training, education programs in our correctional centers. There are some prisons that have excellent programs that have schools and UNISA hubs and workshops where people learn artisanal skills, but there are many prisons that don't have any of that or can only offer it to very few inmates. That means those inmates aren't actually getting an opportunity to improve themselves, to learn skills that will lead them away from a life of crime on release. So we want to encourage the department and empower the department to expand those skills. Linked to that is empowering the department to hire skilled professionals who can administer those programs, who can make decisions about parole eligibility, and that includes social workers and psychologists. We have a shortage of social workers and psychologists in our country in general, and that's how it manifests in our prisons. And then definitely we're concerned with better remuneration, better training, better standards for parole boards. And we also have some thoughts about the life of parole process that we've been discussing in earnest with the minister. We think that rather than having the minister make the ultimate decision in every case, the National Council for Correctional Services, which is a body of judges, of criminological experts, members of SAPS, prosecutors, should make those decisions. Currently, they make recommendations to the minister, but we think they should be the decision makers and the minister should have a veto power. And the reason we suggest that is because it's a lot of work for the minister to consider every single one of these profiles. When we created the system, there were in 1995, there were 400 people sentenced to life in our prisons. There are now more than 18,000 people. So it's a massive increase and a massive burden on the minister. And we think if he has that veto power, but doesn't have to make every single decision himself, then we can have a more efficient parole system where we can have those decisions being made by these experts who have already been appointed. So there's lots to say, but I think those are the key areas we'd be focusing on in a reform process.
Sohela, you've shocked me. I mean, just when you talk about the 400, that we come from a country just, less than 3 decades ago when we had 400 people serving life. Now we have 18,000. And maybe, I was going to let you go, but now I have to ask, how did we get that wrong? Because there's a sense now that correctional services needs to be doing the work of rehabilitating. Who's dropping the ball before that even happens?
It's a big question with a lot of big answers. What's interesting is that increase in the number of people serving life sentences isn't linked to a proportionate increase in crime, or at the very least not to a proportionate increase in serious violent crime. The best statistics we have tell us that after the transition to democracy, crime rates went down, especially murder rates, which are a very reliable way of thinking about violent crime, because they're not dependent on reporting. You find a body, you can tell when a murder has happened. Crime rates went down for a very long time, until around 2011 or 2012, and then they just began to shoot up again. And so now we're at about the same levels as we were during kind of the worst days of apartheid and transition violence. So that's just to say that we aren't locking more people up for longer because we have more crime. We actually took a wrong turn. We decided that harsh sentences, long sentences, very harsh approaches to parole was the right way to go to make our country safer.
Right.
And we were following the example of the United States of America, which has the biggest prison population in the world. At JIX, we think that was a mistake. And we think imposing harsh mandatory minimum sentences didn't actually make us safer. What would have made us safer is focusing on the education, healthcare, the services that make communities actually safer, but also focusing on crime intelligence, investigation, detective work that can prevent crime from happening before it happens, but also that can make sure we're sending the people at the very top of the crime food chain to prison rather than taking a small amount of people who commit crime and just sending them to prison for incredibly long periods of time.
Okay, very interesting. This was eye-opening. Sohela, thank you so much for speaking to us. We really do appreciate your time. Sohela Surajpal there speaking to us, law clerk and legal researcher at the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services.